Welcome to meeting 36 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages. Pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, May 30th, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of BC 13, an act to amend the Official Languages Act to enact the French language use by private enterprises under Federal Jurisdiction Act and to make related amendments to other acts. Today's meeting is being held in a hybrid format in accordance with the order of the House adopted on Thursday, June 23, 2022. Members may participate in person or by using Zoom. To ensure the meeting runs smoothly, I would like to pass along some instructions to witnesses and members. Before you speak, please wait for me to call your name. If you are participating via video conferences, click on the microphone icon to activate the sound. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Regarding interpretation, for those of you who are on Zoom, this is important. You can choose your language at the bottom of the screen. Click on the planet icon to choose floor, English, or French. For those of you who are in the room, you could use the earpiece and choose the desired channel. I would like to remind you that all comments from members and witnesses should be directed to the chair. For the members who are in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For those of you who are on Zoom, please use the virtual raise hand function. The clerk of the committee and myself will do our best to keep the speaking order, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding in this regard. Per our routine motion, I would like to inform the committee that all witnesses have completed the required login tests prior to the meeting. I would like to welcome our witnesses now, in the room and on Zoom. So to start, the Association of Canadian Port Authorities with Daniel Robert Gooch, President and Chief Executive Officer. We also have the Commission Nationale des Parents Francophones with Gillian Anderson, President, online, and Jean-Luc Racine, Executive Director, who is here in the room with us. I would like to remind witnesses that they have 5 minutes for opening remarks. I'm very strict about time. I want to warn you in advance. If you run out of time, no worries. You'll be able to complete your statements through the questions that we'll ask you. I would like to start with, in English or in French, the Association of Canadian Port Authorities. Mr. Gooch, you have the floor.
Merci.
Thank you to the members of the committee for giving me the opportunity to meet you today to talk about C13. I'm Daniel Robert Gooch, and I'm the president of the Association of the Canadian Port Authorities. We represent the 17 Canadian port authorities that move the most of Canada's international cargo. We operate at arm's length of government to manage federal port lands.
Support the protection of Canada's official languages and are diligent about meeting their obligations under the OLA. However, there are some concerns with how official language issues are already handled today under current legislation. As Canada's port authorities are charged with operating federal port assets at arm's length of government, they are expected to operate self-sufficiently and independently from each other. While all port authorities work to promote and enable Canada's trade, this is done primarily at a localized level within each port authority's regional jurisdiction as set out in its letters patent. Their resource levels vary significantly, with some having only a handful of staff. They also operate in many parts of the country where finding staff with minority language capabilities can be quite challenging. The concerns we have with Bill C-13 are directly related to these factors, for which the one-size-fits-all approach on perceived official language requirements under the Canada Marine Act today raise concerns about Bill C-13. OLA compliance is more burdensome for port authorities than for other federal institutions, which are larger and national in scope, a matter that C-13 would exacerbate. The tension port authorities are already facing to increase transparency and work toward better alignment with local communities through greater local communication will be increasingly in conflict with the risk of failure to comply with OLA requirement and increased exposure to vexatious complaints. While some official language complaints are well-founded and require corrective action, Our members have in recent years faced increasing complaints that are vexatious in nature and do not, in our view, protect or assist with the values that the OLA stands for. For example, our ports strive to consult extensively with the community on major developments with the potential to impact the community, such as infrastructure and construction projects. It has been a shared goal of Canada's port authorities and the Government of Canada to build on our port efforts to be more consultative and collaborative with users and the communities they serve. Our members have made major efforts to improve on this over the years since the CPAs were established. It's a trend we understand Transport Minister Alghabra would like to see continue. An increased consultation may be mandated in amendments to the Canada Marine Act that we expect to come forward soon. But the Official Languages Commissioner interpretation on port OLA obligations, combined with these proposed changes to the Act, threatens to blow these efforts significantly off course. Our member ports are regularly diverted by complaints from out-of-province individuals who have developed a niche business reviewing port websites to find highly local consultation documents provided only in the language of the community. Even though these initiatives are entirely local in scope, complainants are earning thousands of dollars simply by searching for these materials online from the comfort of their home thousands of kilometers away. Surely this is not the intent of the Official Languages Act, nor consistent with the intent of the federal government when it established port authorities more than 20 years ago. These complaints are not coming from port users or local residents, yet they continue to be advanced and investigated by the Official Languages Commissioner without regard to the nature, accuracy, or veracity of the complaint. Our members must respond to these investigations, which divert staff and financial resources that would be otherwise dedicated to communication and collaboration with users and stakeholders who are actually in the community. Given this is the situation today, port authorities are concerned that the expanded powers of the OLC, including administrative monetary penalties proposed in Bill C-13, would exacerbate the situation. Canada's port authorities do not enjoy the limitless resources of the federal government with which they must compete for bilingual employees. In many of the regions of the country, it is difficult for our members to recruit bilingual employees. These practical differences in operations and local distinctions should not expose port authorities to unreasonable penalties. Additionally, unlike airport authorities, which share many characteristics with our members, port authorities are subject to Part 7 of the OLA, which outlines the government's goals of not just protecting, but enhancing minority language rights and fostering the full recognition of both languages. While laudable goals, it is hard to reconcile these with the mandate of Canada's port authorities to operate port assets at arm's length of government in a way that supports...
Mr. Gouche.
That supports Canadian trade and competitiveness as outlined in the Canada Marine Act. It is crucial, we submit that this part of the OLA should not apply to Canada's port authorities in the same way it does not apply to airport authorities.
Thank you, thank you. Monsieur, no, Madame...
Madame Anderson, you will be speaking for the Commission Nationale des Parents Francophones. So, Madame Anderson, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And dear members, it is a great pleasure for the Commission Nationale des Parents Francophones to appear before you to speak about Bill C-13. We are very happy to see that we are nearing the adoption of the new Official Languages Act. The modification of this act is essential and vital for our OLMCs. We are very happy to see that the bill seeks to recognize the education continuum and its importance, and that early childhood education programs are an integral part of the education journey for the minority language community. We'd like to say that we support the 5 amendments that were proposed by the Fédération des communautés francophones et acadiennes, the FCFA, to be able to reach a bill that meets the aspirations of all Canadians. We would like to take advantage of this opportunity to insist on the 5 amendments that were proposed by the FCFA and that have a major impact on the development of our communities. The importance of integrating clear and robust linguistic clauses in provincial and territory transfer agreements is capital. We want to insist on that today. And we also want to add that it's important to have firm and unequivocal commitments related to the language clauses. Here's why it's so important. As you know, the federal government concluded early learning and childcare agreements with the provinces and territories in 2017. However, there were clauses linguistic clauses in these agreements, but they were very vague and unspecific. And they also varied from one province to the other. For example, in Manitoba, the government had committed to an action plan through its bilateral plan to make sure that 14% of the spots would be allocated to francophones in the province. Although today, Manitobans can certify that they've received the funding and the number of spots promised has been delivered. However, even if there was a clause in all of the agreements in 2017 saying that the government needed to take care of francophones in a minority situation, when there was no firm commitment connected to the linguistic clauses, francophones were not able to receive anything, for example, in British Columbia, in Alberta, and in the Northwest Territories. Even worse, between 2017 and 2021, the francophones of British Columbia were never consulted, never were visited by government officials to understand the needs of the francophone community with regard to early childhood education. In 2021, the government signed a second wave of new agreements on early childhood education and daycares with the provincial and territorial governments. This time, linguistic clauses are a little bit more specific. But what's missing is the commitment from provinces and territories to meet specific targets. So we're concerned about the lack of commitment, and here are two examples that show the scope of our concerns. In 2021, the Nova Scotia government, with federal government funding, said that it wanted to combine the management of all daycares, both English and French, under the same provincial agency. This agency exists already, and its management is only Anglophone. It is unacceptable that French language daycares be managed by Anglophone organizations. They were able to get the government to change course on this file. Decisions still need to be made, and we are still concerned. The government of Ontario recently announced that it was going to grant funding to daycares where the salaries are beneath $19 an hour. But francophones will not receive any funding in this program. In fact, francophones have been relying on retaining education, francophone educators, and their pay already exceeds $19 an hour, albeit only a little bit. So these education services, often profit-based, will benefit from public funding, and francophones won't. It is essential that Bill C-13 be adopted as soon as possible. The government will present an action plan on official languages soon, and it is essential that this plan should support the new Official Languages Act that will have been adopted by the House of Commons and the Senate. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. You did it in the time that was allocated. I would like to note the presence of Ms. Bazan, who is replacing Ms. Ashton today. Welcome to the best committee on Parliament Hill. We'll start with a round of questions. So for the witnesses, the way this works, you will receive questions from each party. Each party gets 6 minutes for questions and answers. I'm really strict about the time because it allows everyone to ask their questions. So for 6 minutes, we have the first vice chair of this committee, Joël Godin. You have the floor, Mr. Godin, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. My question is for the Association of Canadian Port Authorities. You talked about regulations that are restrictive for you, despite the fact that the commissioner has rights related to complaints, more targeted complaints. I would like to hear you say what this means for you. You've mentioned vexing complaints. That's the word you used. You know, the Act is there to allow us to stop the decline of French, to protect it and improve the use of official languages. We understand here that French is suffering, but you're saying that you're not comfortable with the commissioner's powers to impose administrative monetary penalties. You're saying that people are abusing this, that they are lining their pockets by trolling the internet. Can you give us some examples and tell us how many complaints the Association of Canadian Port Authorities received in the last year?
Merci.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to answer in English.
We are not the recipient of complaints. It is the Port Authorities. I know that my organization has not, but other organizations have put forward access to information requests to understand the nature of the complaints and have not been able to get that information. I do know that from our members that the incidence of complaints has increased in the last 5 to 7 years. I'll give you an example. I think that the challenge that our ports struggle with is they are seeking to be more consultative with Indigenous groups, with communities, with the people and the users in the actual market where they serve. To do so effectively requires lots of documents. And so what we're seeing is individuals who have absolutely nothing to do with that. They're not local. They're in the other part of the country. They've discovered that they can just go on websites and, okay, so this consultation document, you see at the bottom of page 5, you refer to, an appendix, and that is in English. And we don't believe that was the spirit of why Official Language Act obligations were put on Canada Port Authorities. We've seen the incidence of these increase in recent years, and we think that the perverse impact of that is that ports now will have an incentive to consult less or provide less documents. And that's not where Minister Alghabra wants the industry to go. That's not where the Government of Canada seems to want the industry to go. We are expecting Canada Marine Act amendments that, if anything, will increase the requirements for consultation on the part of the Port Authorities. They want to comply, but they want to comply in the spirit of that and not be hijacked by individuals who have discovered that they can make money in this way.
What you're saying is that we need to have more consultations. But in the past, we've seen that in your sector, as in many other sectors, these consultations don't actually do anything to protect both languages. So what do you think the Association of Canadian Port Authorities can do to protect both official languages?
Our members are seeking to comply with the requirements of the OLA. Greater clarity on what the expectations are, would be helpful. But we don't believe that what is happening now is in the spirit of the Official Languages Act. We believe it is opportunism, quite frankly. We've heard examples.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I just don't have much time. You don't have any specific ideas to propose to improve this bill?
To improve we do have one request, which is that the Port Authorities be treated a bit more like the airport authorities. There is an obligation. The way the law is the way the requirements are written for Port Authorities. There's an obligation that they are to promote the use of French in the community in the same way that a federal institution would be. The airport authorities do not have that requirement, so that would be one improvement. Another, and I can't tell you how to draft this, but the situation we have today is that port authorities are treated as if they're a head office. And so,
sorry to cut you off. Time is short. Quick question. I forgot my question. Sorry, how long? What I want to verify with you is the following. You've demonstrated that you want to be exempt from the obligations of this law, if that's what I've understood. So you'll understand that all corporate citizens have to do their part, whether they're Anglophone or Francophone. So is the association ready to sacrifice certain requests or demands in order to have a positive result for the community?
I'm not sure I answered the question, but can you continue to answer the one that you asked earlier?
Merci, Monsieur Gouche. Merci, Monsieur Godin. On pourrait peut-être élaborer plus loin.
Sorry, time is up. We might be able to continue a little bit later. Next questions from the Parliamentary Secretary of this committee, Marc Serré, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for your presentations today to the witnesses. I want to continue in the same direction. Mr. Gouche, you indicated in your presentation that is a labor shortage. This is the case everywhere. You operate in remote areas, and maybe you can't offer services in French. We're currently studying Bill C-13, and we want to protect the decline of French. You didn't really answer the question earlier, but what is your role? Because you do have a role, and you have to be offering services in French. So why don't you offer services in French right now?
Port authorities strive to offer services in French. What is happening is there's a game going on where individuals are seeking out obscure documents. We've heard one case where a port got in trouble because there were 2 words that were not translated. The Official Languages Commissioner has a certain amount of flexibility in how he or she applies the requirements, and we're not seeing that.
Vous avez des objections que le commissaire ait plus de sanctions?
Do you have money to train employees in French?
I don't have a figure in mind. What I'm asking is, what we would like to see is that the requirements be applied in the spirit in which they were intended, and that our port authorities not be diverted by individuals who are simply profiting from the system. One of the challenges we have, it's bizarre, but the port authorities are treated as if they were headquarters. And so we actually have a situation where a port authority... If I could...
Donc, vous n'avez rien pour la formation.
J'arrête le temps un instant. Monsieur Gouche, les membres du comité ont très peu de temps, 6 minutes chacun.
The members of the committee don't have much time, 6 minutes each. You have to answer. They're the ones who are asking the questions. So they've asked you a question, so I would ask you to follow the directives as usual. So you don't have any money for the training for second language training. In some questions, it's 3 or 4 questions. In Canada, we only have 2 questions. So why is it so difficult? You are in agreement with the whole official languages idea, but not that it would apply to you. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Ports are striving to fulfill the requirements of the Official Languages Act. It's not just about money. It's also about the availability of training. Under federal institutions, there's funding available for French language training. It isn't available to port authorities. But even if it was available, would they be able to find it? Would they be able to find the employees? Port authorities are competing with federal organizations with very generous pension and benefits. Port authorities are operating at arm's length of government. That was an intentional decision of the government of Canada to put entrepreneurial spirit into the administration of port authorities. And they are doing their best to fulfill their significant mandates for trade, but at the same time, we're respecting the requirements for official languages.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Anderson.
Ms. Anderson, Mr. Racine, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Gouche. You have talked about adopting the bill as soon as possible. Can you talk about how the action plan is related to C-13? Because we are trying to add more to it and support the communities. So why do you think it's important to adopt Bill C-13 as quickly as possible so that we can then move on to the action plan? I'll start, and then I will allow my executive director to continue. Of course, it's very important to have those clauses in place as quickly as possible when we're talking about early childhood, because when we're talking about children, they won't come back later. So it's important for the children between 0 and 5 years old are supported as soon as possible. Jean-Luc, the Action Plan on Official Languages 2023 or 2028 to 2023 is ending soon, so all of the funding will end for Francophone organizations unless we have a new one by then. So what we would like is for that new action plan, which is very inspired by the Official Languages Act, the quicker we adopt it, the more it will inspire the action plan, and it will also legitimize it. That's what we're hoping for. 40 seconds. You also talked about linguistic clauses. Can you expand on that? You talked about a difference between 2017 and now. In 2022, can you expand on linguistic clauses with regards to early childhood operationally, for example, because some provinces seem to have different ideas about what a linguistic clause implies? I'll let Jean-Luc answer. I'll probably have opportunities to come back to it, but I do have some very clear examples for you. They will illustrate how without them we have no money for the communities. Mr. Mario Beaulieu, co-chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses who are here to help us improve this bill. My first question is for the CNPF, Commission Nationale des Parents Francophones. I read a study from quite a while ago. Where did the billions go? It was published in 1996, and it talked about the Official Languages Act with regards to education. If the official languages education acted as a way to restrict French, as it did for a long time, well, one of the conclusions on funding from 1970 to 1988, as you said, only 28.5% of the funds were given to Francophones outside of Quebec for education in their their mother tongue. But for Anglophones, got 47.7% of the funding. 9.5% in Quebec as well. Do you find that the situation in this study demonstrates that there was a very big negative impact on Francophones that were assimilating, while most of the resources were given to Anglophones in Quebec? Jillian, would you allow me to go forward? This is why we need linguistic clauses, I think, because all of the funding goes through provincial territorial agreements in the country. So if we don't have linguistic clauses, then we will not have our fair share. How can we come back and say, you didn't give us our fair share when it's not even in the bill? It's not even written. Here's a very clear question, and it will allow me to answer the previous question. In British Columbia, they signed the agreement in 2021. The government committed to spending $11.3 billion for Indigenous daycare services. And that is a great thing. We don't complain about that. Do you know how much they promised Francophones? To consult them. That's all. So that's why we need linguistic clauses that are very strong and have clear targets. We need commitments. Why is the BC government willing to engage and commit to certain things with the Indigenous population, which is great, but not with Francophone population? In 2017, they were supposed to consult the Francophone community. Do you know when they met with the Francophone community? April 2022. So between 2017 and 2022, there was no meeting, there was no consultation, no funding for Francophones. So if we don't want to go through what you're talking about again, then we do need clear linguistic clauses with very clear targets. That the experience has shown us, such as in BC, that when the provincial government makes a firm commitment, we see results. When it's vague, then we don't get anything. That's what we're seeing. That's what we're experiencing. Do you represent Quebec as well? No, outside of Quebec. Francophones that are outside of Quebec. What I saw in the report is that there is a commitment to increase the funding for immersion schools, but not for the schools that are mother tongue, teaching the mother tongue. So for the children of Francophone parents, it encourages assimilation. Should there not be some commitments to increase funding in first language schools? Indeed, we will have demands with regards to that. We hope so, but we also want that for early childhood. If we're actually in C13, it would be more clear. I do think that there's a recognition of the continuum in the bill, but for us, we want to go through elementary school and high school. So first, we have to start funding schools for and by Francophones, indeed, and early childhood education as well. And for linguistic clauses, in Quebec, the positive measures only encourage English. So the Francophone or the provincial government seems to be a little bit against the Francophone communities. Ms. Gazan, you have 6 minutes.
Very nice to be in committee today. I apologize. Je pratique ma français, mais pas bien.
I do speak French, but not very well.
Questions in English. My first question is actually for Ms. Anderson. The CNPF qualified C13 as a step in the right direction, but that it clearly needs improvements. I know that the NDP has been fighting for linguistic clauses to be included in the bill and to support improvements to happen. From your standpoint, is this amendment being passed, or amendments being passed, a requirement for your organization to continue to support the bill? And if you could provide some background, why or why not? Thank you.
C'est essentiel qu'on a.
It is crucial that linguistic clauses be adopted specifically for Francophones in minority situations, communities. As Jean-Luc mentioned earlier, the clauses need to be specific to minority community Francophones, and I'll let him expand on that. Certainly, I think that we do support this bill. We think that it's going in the right direction. But as Ms. Anderson specified, we believe that there should be some modifications. I think it's clear what the Federation is asking for. But I think what we're asking for is really crucial, and I think that we'd be missing out on a great opportunity of having a really solid bill if we don't include the linguistic clauses. I think that's what will allow this bill to go forward.
Amendments aren't made, will your organization still be supporting the bill? Yes or no?
If I may, Ms. Anderson? What we want to see is a bill with amendments that is answering the particular needs of Francophones. We want the amendments that we've proposed. We think that they're reasonable, and I think that it also ensures the flourishing of these communities. So it's very difficult to say that we are for a bill where the linguistic clauses are lacking, because it does hurt our organization. And I'd like to talk later about some experiences that we're going through that demonstrate that we really do need these clauses.
Thank you so much. Again, my question for Ms. Anderson. When the federal government reached an agreement with the provinces and territories, you indicated, or you stated, or not stated, but felt that it was a major setback for Francophones, mostly because there were no linguistic clauses to protect French minority communities' rights to have access to French early child care centres specifically. You, in fact, had called the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development to make sure these clauses were included in the agreements, specifically for those that were not signed yet for Ontario. The Liberal government chose to ignore that. So what are the consequences now for Francophone parents to try and access French early childhood centres, or the consequences for early childhood centres that are French that may not receive the same funding as other early childhood centres? And do you think this could have been avoided with linguistic clauses in the agreements?
100%, je pense.
100%. I think it's absolutely essential to force provincials and provinces and territories to negotiate these agreements. When there are no rules or laws that say what has to be included for Francophone minorities, there are no obligations, and the consequences is that the culture and the languages die. We don't have the same services as Anglophones, and a parent who has to choose between a program that is 10 times more expensive, the parents will choose what's cheaper with everything that's going on in the world right now. So it's important that the federal government will insist that provinces and territories negotiate these agreements to make sure that there's something in each province and territory to support Francophones in minority situations.
30 seconds.
I know that the committee heard from witness from Francophone communities across the country that relayed the same concern that you shared. They don't have enough schools. They need better access to French schools that are run by and for Francophone communities and people. Perhaps in the next round of questions you can follow up on that. I know that we don't have a lot of time. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Next question, 5 minutes from Mr. Bernard Généreux. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the witnesses. Mr. Racine and Ms. Anderson, my questions are for you. The action plan that was tabled by the government in the last 5 years didn't work, according to what you said. This is obvious. There was also hundreds of millions of dollars that were spent. With the examples you gave, it's absurd to think that there was no consultation after 5 years, that the school boards are managed by Anglophones only. There's no accountability here. The federal government didn't ask the provinces to be accountable with the current act. What do you think we can do with this act to change things? Ms. Anderson or Mr. Racette? I'll start and I'll let my colleague answer after. We trust that this is still a bilingual country. We have to have faith and hope that the federal government will support both official languages. We have no other choice to hope that things will change, that the act will prove that they value francophones, that they know that it's important to fund the minority. Ms. Anderson, I'd like to believe you, and I'd like to believe that we could believe in the federal government, but I don't know that that's the case. Mr. Racine, in the examples that you gave us, again, in the current bill, you're asking for changes, and you're talking about linguistic clauses. Would you accept, for example, that Quebec be included in linguistic clauses to make sure that there are some in the Act? Honestly, I think this is a decision that you need to make politically. What we want is that for Francophone communities, that there is access to these clauses. The more specific they are, the more the action plans that are related to these agreements include firm commitments, better it will be. Well, what we've heard, and I'll repeat myself, based on what you've experienced in the last 5 years, all of the money that the Liberal government spent for Francophone communities in minority situations, nothing has improved, really. French is declining throughout Canada. Well, I want to say that, yes, there were investments with the new action plan on official languages. There were investments in early childhood education for Francophones from the federal government. But what's still problematic is the provincial territorial agreements. This is where we lose control. We don't know what's going on. Well, that money should come with obligations by virtue of the Act. Yes, again, we're going to function with regulations again and with positive measures. What does that even mean? What will these even do? I have a lot of difficulty believing that these positive measures will be implemented and that they will have tangible results that are different than what we've seen in the last 5 years, even the 50 last years. I think with linguistic clauses and with agreements, we'll see provincial action plans that will include positive measures. Let me give you another example. The British Columbia government decided to, for the $10 a day daycares, you need to be operating at 70% of the permit that was granted. For Francophones, it's so difficult to recruit that this is impossible. So here's some news for you. $10 daycares will be only for Anglophones in British Columbia, and Francophones will not be able to access them because they can't run at 70%. What do you mean the 70%? You mean the management of the school? Of the daycare. We're talking about daycare here. This is a daycare agreement. So to have access to the $10 a day, to get the funding that makes it $10 a day, you have to be able to be running at 70% capacity. And the English schools are also subject to this. Yes, but the French schools are more affected. This would have been an interesting positive measure. Instead of having it be 70% for Francophone schools, it should be 50% or 40% because we're already in such a difficult situation. For an educator who works in a daycare, they could work on the Francophone side or on the Anglophone side. If the salary is better on the English side, the educator will go there. The opposite isn't true. So it's much more difficult to recruit Francophone educators. And right now, it's a bloodbath. Thank you. Thank you. We'll get back to this. Following questions will come from the microphone is no longer on. From Ms. Kayabaga. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I have a question for Ms. Anderson. You mentioned earlier that you would like to see the federal government force provinces and territories to implement measures. Here's what I'd like to know. How do you see this? Normally, the federal government can't force anyone to do anything. They can encourage the provinces to do things, but what do you understand? What are you trying to say with obligation? Answer. I'm in Alberta, and depending which party is in power, there will be a huge impact on how federal funds are distributed in provinces and territories. So if there are obligations for francophones in minority settings, if we say this amount of money is for francophone communities, don't touch it, it's not for another project, it will have a huge impact because then we know that some funds will come to us rather than just hoping and praying that it will. That's currently what's going on. Each province and territory decides how the funds will be spent and who they'll consult. This is not something that can happen in every province. It changes from year to year with each new government. So if things went last time we received funding, it might go better the next time. We don't want to rely on that. Maybe obligation is not the correct term to use, but I think we need to make sure that there are agreements that are specific for francophone organizations. I appreciate the sentiment, and I know that it's very difficult to have two levels of government that can't work together to arrive to an agreement that meets the needs of the community. You understand that forcing anyone to do anything isn't very possible for us. You talked about how important C13 is, how important it is for us to adopt it. For communities like yours in Manitoba, the situation is urgent. French is declining throughout Canada. But for communities like yours, can you tell us how important it is to have this act adopted as soon as possible? We can continue to niggle about the fact that it's not perfect, and we're waiting, and this has an effect on our communities. The longer it takes to adopt it, of course, there will be effects. But Mr. Racine mentioned earlier that it's important that we include these 5 amendments that were requested. I think we're so close. So this is ongoing work. Yes. But it has to be done as soon as possible. Mr. Racine, do you have anything to add? I think it's very rare to reach a consensus on a bill nationally. But that's what we have here now. Yes, there are a few objections here and there related to the the bill, but we know that we have some momentum now. But the longer we wait, the longer it's delayed, the more we seek this, the longer we wait, the more this consensus risks degradation. You know, we were looking at this at the FCFA. This process was started 6 or 7 years ago. It's taking a long time. The time is nigh. We need to get everyone to cooperate on the act, and we need to move forward. I completely agree with you. I'm a member of a linguistic minority in London, so I know the importance of having this bill adopted, especially because it includes a clause that says it needs to be reviewed every 10 years. It gives us the opportunity to have a long view on how we can serve francophone communities throughout the country. But we do need to act on behalf of all francophone communities in Canada, specifically for education. You have 10 seconds left. How do you think that the clauses about education can contribute to francophone communities thriving? This is an excellent question, but your time is up. We will move on to Mario Beaulieu. You have 2.5 minutes. Let's talk about the importance of moving quickly to adopt this act. In Quebec, where 90% of francophones in Canada live, we provide a lot of the teachers in the market. French is still declining in Quebec. In Bill C-13, there is almost nothing to counteract this. The federal government will continue to contribute to anglicizing Quebec. So it's important to support Quebec so that Quebec can continue to counteract the decline of French throughout Canada. Otherwise, we'll be counterproductive. Well, you know, what we want is to meet the needs of Francophones. Outside of Quebec. Yes, outside of Quebec. What's happening in Quebec is not really, it's not for us to speak about it. Mr. Beaulieu, you understand that we can't speak about what Quebec should do. Maybe another question would be for the Association of Canadian Port Authorities. Do you have Francophones in your board? There are 5 or 6 members in Quebec who are Francophones. Carl Laberge, who is the president of the board of directors in Saguenay, Pierre Gagnon in Sept-Îles, Denis Caron in Belledune in New Brunswick. So those people are part of the board of administration. Yes. Okay. So in your briefing note, you talk about vexing complaints. You seem very defensive about complaints and the commissioner's powers. Would you say that all complaints are unjustified? All of the complaints that you're receiving. You have 20 seconds to answer. No, I've already said that there are some complaints that are valid, but some people do this as a part-time job.
To our ports and said, we found this on your website.
Thanks, Mr. Gouche. Okay. Thanks. The floor is for Mrs. Gazan for 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Thank you so much, Chair. So going back to Ms. Anderson, you spoke about early childhood centers, and we've also heard, as I indicated, witness after witness from Francophone communities across the country that have relayed the same concerns as you in terms of access to French language, not enough schools, the need for better access to French schools run by and for Francophone communities and people, new Canadians included, that would like to have an education in French but can't get it. And I am a Manitoban, and I know that this is a real reality. What do you think we need to do to get to a point where everyone that would like to have their education in French be able to get it?
I think the schools should be equivalent. It's interesting because I lived my whole life in Alberta, and my parents are from Manitoba. What I see, I have children that are in high school and one who's in university, and they choose English programs because they have better funding. We can't compete with these programs without funding to provide at least a basic education that is equivalent to that in Anglophone schools. That's why it's so important to fund various programs, French services, and to make sure that our young people stay here and don't leave us to become Anglophones. Mr. Gooch, our co-witness, would have a better time recruiting Francophone employees if we had better education.
I know that funding in Manitoba for schools, the amount of funding that a school receives is based on the number of students provincially. Do you think that there needs to be changes in terms of funding so that we can accommodate and support Francophone schools?
Absolutely, without a doubt. This has always been the case. I think it will continue to be the case. we're not seeking to have the same amount of funding as English schools. We actually need more funding to create the same types of programs because we don't have the numbers. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Thank you. Before we end this session, I know I'm strict about the timing, but it allows everyone to have the time they need to ask their questions. But I would like to remind all witnesses that if you think there's any information that the committee should have from you and you didn't have the time to say it, please send it to our clerk in writing. She will share it with all members of the committee. So please don't be shy to share any information that you didn't have the opportunity to convey because the chair was a little too strict on the timing. Our members here are used to it. With that, thank you for being here. Thank you so much, sincerely. The meeting is suspended and we're moving in camera.
On reste ici. Oui.
Merci.